Greetings and welcome to a new review about the S24. In this video, I'll be reviewing the long time usage of this device. I've had this device for about 2 weeks, and these 2 weeks had different kinds of scenarios. For example, using it under direct sunlight or using it within a not so much of a good data range, not so much of a good reception. How much would that affect the battery? By the way, this is the Exynos version, not the Snapdragon version, so I'll be answering all your concerns about the battery drain during poor network connections, battery drain during night, and all of that. First of all, it's worth mentioning that after I've let this device settle and set up all of its new features, I've run the benchmark Antutu again and I got even higher results. Now this Antutu benchmark scores up to 1.8 million Antutu points, as you can see, whereas in my previous test it was only scoring about 1.6 million. So it's closer to the Snapdragon as ever. It's not as good as the Snapdragon as I always say, but it's actually very close. This is the first test I've done after letting this device settle. And now to the second most important test. Okay, this test actually reflects the real life scenario of using this device in a poor connection or bad reception places. I was on a train moving to different areas, and most of these areas had no connection whatsoever to the internet and bad reception. So the mobile struggled to find a connection that has to do all with the modem, the Exynos modem. And I was using it with a brightness more than half of its intensity. So that is the very worst case scenario of this device. As you can see, the results are not that effective or not that good as we saw in our previous video. As you can clearly see, the device would use half of its battery for almost 3.5 hours of screen on time during these circumstances. That gives us almost 7 hours, a little bit less or a little bit more of the screen on time using this device on bad reception areas, using it with higher than average brightness. Okay, that is the case of this scenario. Okay, let's talk about the bad numbers now. During this scenario where I had very poor reception as well as the data turned on and syncing all of our stuff, okay, the screen off time drain was a little bit on the excessive side. As you can clearly see, it almost used 20% of the battery on screen off time, whereas about 5 hours. If we round it up, it's about 20% in 5 hours. That means in every hour, it drained 4% of the battery when it is connected to the data on a poor network conditions. Okay? So that is about 4 times the battery drain you would get normally if you use this mobile on normal circumstances. So in my previous video, I've shown that the screen off battery drain rate was about 1% approximately for every hour. Okay, but that was on a perfect condition. That was either connecting to the Wi-Fi or connected to a stable data network. But when you have a very unstable data network and syncing all of your stuff, that would be the drain. Keep in mind that all of these calculations were made using always on display as well as the always ready fingerprint scanner. Okay, so as you can see, when I turn off this device, this is the screen that is normally shown. That is the screen which drains a little bit more of the battery. Okay, but that is how I use my device. Okay, back to business. This is the worst case scenario, you can see. So you can get up to, let's calculate it together, up to 9 or 10 hours of mixed usage in bad circumstances or bad conditions of this device. If you use it, for example, for 5 hours screen on time and 5 hours screen off time. Okay, these are my calculations. And now my third calculation is getting back to home and seeing if anything changed after the battery learned my usage patterns, but you can clearly see that it went back to its normal drain. You can see it here. Screen on time used about 17% of battery for about 150 minutes of screen on time. That means every hour uses about 10%. So that approximately gives you 10% of battery for every hour you spend on this device. But that does not necessarily mean that you would get the same exact screen on time for every scenario, for every usage. My usage varied as well as my screen on time. The application also calculates the average of all of your usages during this time, and it gives you a screen on time estimate. For example, when I was out, it used more, but when I was at home, it used less. So the approximate of what I used were about, as I said, 10% per hour. The screen off time, on the other hand, since I used it on a lot of the scenarios where I had bad connection, we can see that it almost used 2% for every hour, or 1.5% for every hour you spent on screen off time. Okay? These calculations were based on about 3 days, 15 hours of screen off time. That is about 70 hours if we use this device as screen off. Okay, for 10 hours per day, that means it's about 7 days of screen off time. So that is the calculation we got. And that pretty much sums up my experience for this device. When I leave it draining throughout the night, okay, I usually turn off the data as well as the Wi-Fi, so I will not get bothered. And that almost uses about 1 or 0.8% of battery for every hour. Because I normally wake up after 8 hours of sleep, and I find it about 6 to 7 to 8% less battery, okay? And now I will leave you with some camera shots during the night as well as the sunlight to see how much well this device performs in terms of camera, okay? Let's start. So I'm no professional photographer by any means, but we can clearly see, as it's expected from a flagship of this year, that the camera shots during the sunlight were not bad. They actually showed much of the details, and I prefer it that way. The color balance was on point. I did not like the oversaturation that other or previous models did. Okay, but we're talking a little bit about the night shots. What's interesting that I took most of these photos in absolute night, but you can clearly see that all of the details are clearly shown. If there's one thing that I need to mention is the lens glare. Especially in this photo where we can clearly see the lens glare from the street lights as well as the cars, but the text on the building is still readable. It had all the details it needed. It did not blur out. But on the other hand, we can clearly see in this photo that the lens glare were a little bit on the extreme side. I liked the lettering and the light of the top of this building, Hoppenhof. We can clearly see there were no glare, but on the other hand, the street lights gave much of a glare. By the way, again, this photo was taken in absolute darkness, but the processing of the photo did very well, getting the sky to be actually apparent. And this is the last photo I'll be talking about. You can clearly see that the Rossmann, the shop name in red, is actually pretty much recognizable and readable, but the one on its left, the Starbucks, actually gave much of a glare, which gives you an indication that the phone still struggles with differentiating the different kinds of brightness within two small light emitting sections of the photo. Okay, so keep that in mind. I would give the camera 8 out of 10, especially in darkness, because the color balance was on point, but it did not do its best in minimizing lens glare. So that pretty much sums up my experience for this device. I hope you like this video. If I got to say that one thing that bothered me the most in this device was the inability to use the call recorder on this device, unlike my previous devices. But I found a workaround in this. You can see that I have native call recording features. If you liked, I could show you how to get the native call recording feature back without any kind of messing up your device, without any kind of root whatsoever. If you liked it, please subscribe and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.